Welcome. In this video, we're going to look at the concept of back scheduling, and we're going to look at what it is, give you some examples of it, why it's important with some examples, as well as the impact that back scheduling has with some examples as well. So let's go ahead and get ourselves started here looking at back scheduling, what it is. So first off, back scheduling, it's a scheduling technique that we use to determine the earliest possible start date for an operation or a process based on a given delivery or completion date. It involves working backwards from the required delivery or the completion date, looks at the lead times for the processes, and works backwards through the process to figure out the starting date for that, or the starting time for the operation. And by determining the last start time for each operation or step, we can put together a schedule that ensures the product or service is completed on time. This gets us, one of the things that you'll see is it gets us a more efficient use of time and resources by minimizing idle time, reducing the risks of delays and bottlenecks because everything's known on what has to be done when. Particularly useful in industries with high demand variability, or when there's a tight deadline. So once we get the demand date from the customer, we can work back to see what we have to do for a schedule. But it does require that we have accurate data on things like lead times, production times, delivery times, as well as we have to have effective communication and collaboration between departments and suppliers within the supply chain. So it runs a pretty tight schedule here. So from an example standpoint, if we looked at manufacturing company receives an order for a product that must be delivered in 3 weeks. The backward scheduling process will then involve working backwards from that delivery date, considering time required for shipping, quality, back through assembly, raw materials, procurement. This helps us determine the earliest possible start date for that process. In construction, we've got a deadline to complete a building project by a specific date. Involves working backwards from the completion date, and it's considering the times required for site preparation, foundation work, framing, electrical, plumbing, and finishing work, but it works backwards to determine the earliest possible start date. A retailer, for example, we have to have a product available for sale on a specific date, such as a holiday. So this involves working backwards from the sale date, considering time for delivery, stocking, and merchandising, helps us determine the latest possible delivery date for the product from the supplier. Even in a service industry, if we receive a request for a service that must be completed by a specific date, then we work backwards from the service date, considering the time required for scheduling, prep, execution, and follow-up. And again, this helps us determine the earliest start date for the service to be provided. So let's look at why it's important. On the on-time delivery, it ensures or allows supply chain folks to plan and schedule the entire process, starting from the desired delivery date. Helps us ensure that it's delivered on time to the customer. From a time standpoint, by working backwards from the delivery date, it allows folks to identify any idle time in the production process. This allows us to allocate resources efficiently and minimize any idle time that would otherwise happen. From a capacity utilization standpoint, it helps us plan the use of resources, including labor, equipment, materials, to make sure we have the optimal utilization of capacity. And this ensures that resources are used effectively, efficiently, and helps us reduce costs and improve profitability. From a holding cost standpoint of inventory, we know exactly what's going to be needed when, so this helps us minimize inventory holding costs. We're not holding on to inventory any longer than necessary because we're only producing the necessary amounts when needed. And if you think about the contingency standpoint or the risk standpoint, this backward scheduling helps us identify the critical path. And the critical path is the schedule that must happen on time. So it helps us identify risks and plan contingency measures. So if we go forward then and look at some examples here, we see in these same areas here, I can, on a customer demand standpoint, I can plan production based on the anticipated demand date for the product, which is going to help me reduce inventory and reduce costs as far as that goes too. From an efficiency standpoint, by working backward from the desired delivery date, I can identify bottlenecks and delays again in the production process, which allows me to optimize process, make sure everything's completed on time. Even from a risk standpoint, knowing what that critical path was that we talked about, I can see where I could have problems, and I can identify the risks and put plans in place to address it. And if everybody knows the same plan, from a collaboration standpoint, when everybody knows what's going on, then we're able to communicate successfully. We can have better performance and efficiency, and then relationships improve between the groups there. So moving on then to the impact of using back scheduling. We'll look at it both from a positive and negative standpoint. Positive, we're going to be on time because we know what the customer requirement is, which can increase customer satisfaction and loyalty. Inventory holding costs go down because we know exactly what's needed when. We only produce what's needed. Capacity utilization. Because we're only using the resources we need, we can keep costs down, reduce costs, which automatically can improve profitability. From an efficiency and productivity standpoint, we know exactly what's going to be built when, so we can optimize our production or distribution process. And when everybody's on the same page, we know what the plan is and we all work the plan. Now, the opposite happens as well when we look at what happens if you don't use back scheduling. The complexity gets harder because now how do we coordinate and collaborate with everybody on what needs to be done when, and as things change, how do we keep people informed? Events, if we don't have a schedule, factors or events like weather, supplier availability, quality issues, transportation, these are all things that are time-based, that if we don't have a plan to work against, then we run the risk of missing the schedules on that. If something's delayed or disruption, that can create risk. And if we don't have a schedule we're working towards, again, we're going to end up in doing the wrong things. Costs can go up, especially in the case of risk or disruptions, if we have to come up with contingency measures to deal with these unexpected delays or disruptions. And, the reduced flexibility in a negative way is we're committing to having something done by a specific production to a certain schedule, and we don't have flexibility. So if we're not using back scheduling properly, we have a higher chance of missing those schedules out there. So let me give you some examples of this, and then we'll finish up. Here in Minneapolis, we had a bridge collapse, early mid-2000s, Interstate 35 bridge. And they got it done. They got the bridge rebuilt successfully, very well done, on time and within budget, because part of it was doing the production of all the concrete parts right there at the site and using concurrent engineering. But they had a specific date they were going to open up this bridge by, and they worked backwards to figure out what had to be happening in each step of the process. Back scheduling helped us. I worked at a company called Vollrath Refrigeration. We made walk-in coolers and freezers at the time, and by knowing exactly what was needed when, we were able to schedule our expensive condensing units in right when we need it, built a program with the supplier, and dropped our inventory by 75%. Now, I also mentioned hot list, red hot list, white hot list. This is what happens when we don't have a schedule and we don't stick to the schedule that we think we know better than the plan from our MRP system, and then we end up with expedites on top of expedites on top of expedites. And from a complexity and a confusion standpoint, I say pediatricians because I immediately thought of when our kids were little, but we run into it in medical all the time, is by not having a schedule and sticking to the schedule, we run the risk of double booking, and then we wait forever in the waiting room for the physician to see our children or whatever. Now, granted, they're going to find a way to help us, but it's very inefficient from the patient standpoint, as well as from the doctor's office standpoint, because they have to throw way too many wasted, inefficient steps in to kind of keep people calm about waiting for the doctor and that stuff. Whereas if they had the schedule and put the resources in place to meet it, they'd be able to hit the schedule. So I wanted to give you some examples of where this happens. So.